Sorry if you're watching the video, I forgot to press record. So I'm just taking up quiz 1 right now, or going over the common errors. What else is there? Everything else is fine. I mean, the loop, some people had trouble writing the loop. They're still writing Python-style loops, right? And then here. So if you're checking if two strings are equals, you should always use equals. You should not write equals equals, right? The problem with equals equals is it often works, but it's technically incorrect because you have two reference types and you want to check them using dot equals. The reason it sometimes works is because of the way the string class is implemented. But if you write equals equals, then your code is going to break when someone passes in a new string, is basically what happens, right? So you should always use equals to compare strings and not equals equals. Slightly uncommon, but still happened a few times, is that Java's print line state, so it's Java strings, you can just join them together with plus, right? It doesn't matter what the types are here, as long as the first thing's a string, everything else will work. Right, so you don't have to try to convert the count to a string here, right? And there's no good way to do it either without unless you call a method, right? So some people tried to cast this to a string, that doesn't work, right? Now if you had quiz B, again the common errors are the same: missing class, missing method, missing types. In this one, so this is supposed to be in the Python code. You got what did you get? You got x star star 2. Right, so x raised to the power 2. There is no power operator in Java. So you have to write x times x or math.pow x comma 2 if you really wanted to. Right, x times x is a lot easier. Y times y. The other, I think almost universal error in this one, I think only one or two people managed to avoid this one. If you made count an int, and if you made n an int, right, and you wrote 4 and not 4.0, right, then you run into int division here, right? So you end up with an int divided by an int. Well, an int times an int divided by an int, that produces an int result, right? And in this case, it produces the wrong result. So that has to be evaluated using double arithmetic somehow. So either write 4.0 here, either make count or n a double to begin with, or something like that, right? Or put in a cast or something. So that was the common error there. Quiz C. There aren't so many of you because this is the deferred one. Again, the usual common errors: missing class, missing method. What's on this one? Is there anything? Oh, I guess there was some confusion between an array and a list, right? So the question asks you to. The question doesn't specify which one to use, right? So you can use an array or a list, but it's quite common for people to use a list and then use the array notation, or use an array and then use the list notation to get and set elements. Right, so that's the common error there. Okay, question 2 is, so the first question, it's all the same, it's just the numbers are different. So the first question is, I give you a number and I ask you for a number that is one alp different from that number. Right? So the way you do this, so remember you only have 3 digits, right? So the way you always start these problems is you take the number, so it's 10,000 in this case, right? Well, I guess it's up there. It's 10,000. So you write the number out using your floating point format, right? So in our floating point format, you always use 3 digits, right, to specify the significand, right? So that becomes 100. And then you compute the exponent so that the right-hand side is equal to the left-hand side. Right? So if 10,000 is equal to 100 times 10 to the 2, right? A 1 alp difference is a difference in the last digit, right? So it's a difference in that 0 right there, right? So you can either add 1 times 10 to the 2 or subtract 1 times 10 to the 2, right? And that gives you 10,100 or 9,900. It's the same on all the other questions, right? Just write the number out in the floating point format, change the last digit by 1, and that's a number that's off by 1 alp. Question 2b, they're similar, but they're all slightly different. So the numbers are different, and one version has you use 1 guard digit, the other one does not. So in question 2, again, you write out the numbers using their floating point format, and you use the larger exponent as the exponent. Right? So this was, what was it? It was 225 minus 20 point something. 20.9? All right, so it's 225 times 10 to the 0. Right? Then you write your other one out. This one has no guard digit, so you lose anything after the guess, the decimal place, right? So instead of 20.9, it's just 20. Now, if you rounded it, I think I gave you the marks anyway. So I think I wrote OK and gave you the marks, right? And then you just do the subtraction. So that's 205 times 10 to the 0, right? On B, it's you have one guard digit, right? So you write out your number. So this one's 105 and 9.8, right? So you write out your number using your floating point format. So it's 105. Now you get one extra digit because the question says you use a guard digit. So you add the extra digit after the decimal place, right? And now when you write 9.8 using the same exponent as the larger exponent, right? So that's 9.8 times 10 to the 0. You keep the 8, right? So it doesn't disappear in this case. I don't remember the exact number. It may not be 9.8. But anyway, it's 9.8 it's 9.89, I think. So you just keep that digit that's after the decimal place. You lose any other digits, right? And then do the subtraction. So that's 95.2 times 10 to the 0. You have 3 significant digits, so that fits in our floating point format. Right. C is, what's C? C is 102 and 9.8 something. Is that the same as the other ones? 102, 10. Oh, I just changed the 5 to a 2, I think. And again, you get to use a guard digit, so you just keep one extra digit, do the subtraction, and if you have 3 digits, everything's fine. Just ask questions if you have any, right? Just stick your hand up and I'll answer them as best as I can. Okay, question 3. So this one on quiz A, I don't think, there might have been one student who got full marks on this. I think everybody else forgot to do something. So number 1, so the question says returns a car. So you have to return car, right? You can't return you're not supposed to return a string, right? The name of the method should be the same way, should be named the way that Java names things, right? So camel case, right? Start with a lowercase letter. If there's multiple words in the name, capitalize the first letter of every subsequent word, right? Now this one says generate a random letter between A and Z, right? And it tells you, look, the random class has got this method called nextInt that you can use, right? But random, you need to make a random object, right? Nothing's static inside the random class, right? And so there was a whole lecture or two where we talked about simulating dice and something else, right? Where we used a random class to generate random values, right? So you have to make a random object. Almost, I think only 1 or 2 students actually made a random object, right? Okay, now the problem is how do I get a random letter between A and Z, right? So there's 26 letters, so you need to generate a random value between 0 and 25 inclusive, or 0 and 26 exclusive, right? So that's nextInt, 26, right? And then you somehow have to take that number and add it to A, right? So I start with the letter A as a car, and then I just add the random value to that car, right? You have to be a little bit careful when you do this, right? You have to, so you can't write, unfortunately, if you write C equals C plus RNG nextInt, right? That technically doesn't work because that's an int, right? So that int plus something plus a car becomes an int, and you can't store that in an int. So technically, you have to cast this. So that's technically what you would have to do. I don't remember. Yeah, so I think you would lose like half a mark if you didn't do that, or something like that. There's another random number question in B. So B is generate a random number between -1 and 1. And I tell you, the method nextDouble returns a random number between 0 and 1. Right? Again, you need a random object. Right? So you have to make a random object here. And now you need to figure out how do I make a random number between -1 and 1. Right? So there's a bunch of ways to do it. A lot of students made a random number between 0 and 1, and then checked if it was between 0 and 0.5. If it was, they made it negative, or they kept it positive, and then the other case, they'd make it negative. So that's fine. The easier way to do it, though, is I've got a number between 0 and 1, so if I subtract 1/2, it's between -0.5 and 0.5. Right? Now if I multiply it by 2, it's between -1 and 1. Right? So that's the easier way to do it. The other way to do the previous question is some people wrote a giant if statement. So if the random number was 1, return A. If the number was 2, return B, and so on and so on and so forth. If you wrote that, I mean, that would take you quite a long time to write. It's technically correct, but it's kind of gross. This is the better way to do it. And then in C, you had the swap question. So write a method that takes in an array and 2 indexes and swaps the elements in the array at those indexes. Right? Again, a lot of students confused arrays with lists, and they would use a list instead. A lot of students would return a list or an array for some reason, even though the question says it doesn't ask you to. To do the swap, it's straightforward, right? You just make a temporary variable, store one of the 2 values in the temporary variable, and then just do the reassignment to the 2 variables, right? So that one was relatively straightforward, but surprisingly not that well done. Question 4 on the first test is make a random word using your random letter method, right? Now this one wasn't supposed to be hard, and I think most students did pretty well on this, right? So if I need to make a random word made up of n letters, you just call random letter n times, right? And then stick each letter onto the end of a string, right? So you start with the empty string, write a loop that runs n times, and just join a random letter to the end of the string each time, right? So you can write s plus equals random letter, or you can write s equals s plus random letter. That's fine, right? The string has to be initialized before the loop. I remember some students creating the string inside the loop, right? If you create the string inside the loop, you can't return it because it's only available to you inside the loop. It also asks you to check the condition here. It asks you to check, is the input a reasonable input, right? So here, the only reasonable inputs are strings that are length greater than or equal to 0. Right, so you should check, is the length less than 0, and if not, it asks you to throw an exception, so throw any kind of exception. I didn't care about the exception type, but when you throw an exception, it's throw new and then something, right? This stuff here doesn't matter for the quiz, right? The message. What you don't do here, though, is you don't test is length an int, right? Because in Java, length is always an int, right? There's no way for you to call this method without passing in something that's convertible to int, right? So you never check is the type an int, right? Java is strongly typed, so all the types are specified ahead of time. B asks you to make a list of random numbers, right? Using your random value method from before. So it's exactly the same thing, right? Check, is n less than 0, and if not, throw an exception, right? Now make a list, right? So don't forget how to make a list, right? It's list and then the type inside the list and then new array list. Right, then write your loop, and then use the add method to add a random value to the list. Right, and then don't forget to return the list at the end. C was make a random array instead of a random list. Right, so here you were supposed to make a random array. A lot of students made a random list. Right, this one though you don't have the random method from before. Right, you don't have the random value method, so now you have to do it yourself inside the method. So again, make a random make a random object, right? Then make your array, right? And then write your loop and just set the elements of the array to some random value between 0 and 10. Right? Question 5 was okay. So these were all basically involved a list and they either involved a list and an array or a list and are they all arrays? Yeah, list and array, list and array, list and array. Right? No, this one's list and a string. Okay. So this one asks you to, part A, make a list of characters, right? Or a list that can hold cars, and put each character into the list, right? Unless it's a space. If it's a space, don't put the character into the list. Right? So this one wants you to put the letters H-I, H-O, H-I, H-O into the list. So you have to make a list. It's not a list of car, right? It has to be a list of character because of the way that the list class works, right? So remember, you have to use the wrapper type. You can't use the primitive type in this case, right? And in this case, this is one of the unfortunate cases where the wrapper type is not the same name as the primitive type. So it's character instead of car, right? And now you just write your loop, right? Int n is going to be the thing that counts the number of spaces. Right? Because the question also asks you to count the number of spaces. So now you write your loop, right? You just loop over the length of the string, right? Each time you loop through the string, you want to get the character I from the string, right? So car C is S car at, right? Remember, it's a Java string. It's not a Python string, right? A lot of students wrote S square bracket I. You can't get characters from a string using the square bracket notation, right? And now check, is the character a space, right? So if C equals single quote, space, single quote, right? Not double quote, space, double quote, right? Double quote's string. Single quote's a car, right? So if it's a string, oh wait, spaces, that should be n++, sorry, the answer's wrong. N++, the number of spaces goes up by 1, right? Otherwise, add the character to the list, right? So that was part A. Part B asks you to insert n spaces into the front of the list, right? And so that's easy. You just write a loop, right, from 0 to n, right? And then how do you insert something into a list? Well, it's the add method, right? How do I insert at the front of the list? I have to tell it to add at index 0, right? And then what character should be put into the list? Well, the hashtag should be put into the list. So that's single quote, then the character, right? Not double quote and then the character. Right? Again, double quote indicates a string and not a car. Part B was you had to, instead of a string, you basically had to loop over an array, right? So in this question here, it asks you to take the strings that are in X and put them into Y, right? So the only hitch here is that your array, X is an array, it's not a list, right? And it asks you to put the elements of the array into a list, right? So there's actually a couple of ways to do this. So make the array, make the list first, right? So make the list, so it's an array list of string, right? Then write a loop. So here I've got a counting style loop. If you use the counting style loop, you need to access each element from X using the square brackets, right? So X square bracket I, right? And you call the add method to add that to the list, right? So what you don't do is you don't set the elements of the list, because here you've got an empty list, right? You've got an empty list up here, so there are no elements to set, right? You can't actually set an element in an empty list, so you have to add them to the list first. Now, you could also write a for each loop here, right? So for each string s in X, y.add s, and that would have been sufficient there. Part B was you now had to loop over the second array called up, right? If the string in up is equal to true, you're supposed to capitalize the thing that's stored in y, right? So in this case, you should then go through the list y, capitalize the A, the hello, and the goodbye. Right? So you loop over either x length or up length or y.size. All of those work. Right? Those are all fine because all of those are the same. Should all have the same size or length. Right? And again, the most common problem here is people would write up I equals true. Right? It should be up I dot equals true because you're comparing strings. Right? So again, strings are reference types. With reference types, you should always use dot equals. The other common error, again, is confusing a string with a list. An array with a list, right? So some people would write up.getI, or they would write y square bracket I, or something like that. Right? Now to change the element in the list, that's when you use set. Right? So you set the element at that index. I need to capitalize whatever's sitting right there. So to get whatever is sitting at element I use y_get_I. You could also write x square bracket I here. That would be fine. Right? That gives you back a string. To make a string, to turn a string into all caps, you use to uppercase. Right? I wasn't particularly picky about what you called this method here. Right? So it'll be underlined or circled in red if you gave it the wrong name, but you didn't actually lose any marks if you gave it some funny name. C, I think, is the same question. So in part C, you also had the same question. And so that's the quiz. Anybody have any questions? Anybody? Yes? Yeah, they're supposed to be on OnQ now under assignment and quiz solutions. But when I checked like 20 or 30 minutes, when I checked like 45 minutes ago, the computing web server is down. So I don't know if it's actually visible to you. Is it still down? Yeah, I don't know what's going on. I don't know. I should move these onto OnQ because OnQ's uptime's a lot better than our departmental server. I don't know why our server goes down so often. Content. So they'll be under content. I also noticed that assignment 2 is missing. The assignment 2 solution should be there as well. Oh, I didn't put it there. Sorry. Yeah. So I was creating it, and then I couldn't actually access the web page, so I didn't put it up. They will be here under the section here. Right. So the quizzes will be there, so you actually get the actual quiz, and there's solutions for each one. Any other questions? Yes. Yeah. Yep. No, you can't do that, right? So because X is not a list, right? X is an array. So it turns out there is no constructor that takes in an array. It'd be nice if there was, but there isn't. Yeah. So that was another common problem on that question. Yeah. Any other questions? Super. I'm not going to give a lecture today. So it's the weekend and it's homecoming, so I'm just going to call it quits for today. And I will see you on Monday. Oh, there's